policy. So she's going to try to get under his skin. For Trump, he needs to figure out a way to allay all the fears of everyone in the country who worry that he's not suited for the Oval Office. That's harder in some ways,
yes,
as a matter of preparation, because it's not, he's been himself. Being himself is the problem in some respects.
And we all know, and the psychologists have said this, that he can be pricked easy. When you go after him as an unsuccessful businessman, when you go after him as not as rich, the things that kind of he props himself up on, you put pins in them, he reacts. Here's the other cautionary tale for Trump. We have seen Trump on stage to an audience go at Hillary Clinton.
Right.
It's going to be a different thing now. I'm going to bring the gender thing in. A tall man, angry, tall, belligerent man, and Hillary Clinton.
I sort of feel like you're talking to me right now. An angry, tall, belligerent man.
But it's going to play, particularly because we know the swing are the women voters, the suburban women voters. And watching him, it's one thing to watching him talk out. It's another thing. And you know he's prepped. He's got the gloves on, and he's ready to go. But that could backfire.
You know Trump pretty well.
Yes.
For a pretty long time, right?
Yes.
What are the three things you think that she could do that would most cause him to blow a gasket?
The one thing that, and psychologists have told this, when she repeats his words, it drives him crazy.
Right.
His literal, if you notice in all of her speech, that's what she's doing. So what she's going to do to mock him, she's going to stay toned like this, and, well, like you said, and that's going to drive him crazy. I think we will have an historical moment in that debate one way or the other.
I think she's going to play it like Chris Christie. She's going to be a prosecutor, going to try to prosecute the case.
The tone of her speech, the last speech she gave, the race speech, is going to be the tone. I agree.
All right, that bell went off a while ago, so move on.
Well, that's a bell. That means I read. Okay. There's another person who may be on debate, and on that debate stage, in order to qualify, Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson needs 15% or higher in an average of 5 polls selected by the Commission on Presidential Debates mid-next month. New national survey out by NBC News has Hillary Clinton leading Donald Trump in a three-way 41 to 37%. Johnson is getting 11. Johnson also has to get on enough state ballots to have a mathematical chance of winning a majority vote in the Electoral College. As of today, his campaign says he is only a few states shy of appearing on every ballot and that he is on track to qualify on all 50 states. Okay, right now, let's say he's in there, John. Who does it help hurt more, Hillary or Donald, him being on stage?
Well, first, I do want to point out one thing about that poll, which is you're having a little bit of difficulty counting to 4. There's a 4-way race, not a 3-way race. We got Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate.
But that's if he is on stage.
I understand.
So they're in the 3. 1, 2, 3.
I agree. It helps Trump enormously, right?
Great.
She has all of the experience of having done a lot of one-on-one debates before. One-on-one debates are different than multi-candidate affairs. She's debated Barack Obama many, many times one-on-one. She went one-on-one with Sanders many times. She knows how to do that thing. Trump is going to have a hard time managing the new kind of debate format one-on-one. If he had Gary Johnson on stage with him, it would deflect and allow him to be able to do what he did in the multi-candidate debates and play to his advantage.
I agree with you. You know, he is larger than life, and when it's 3, he becomes literally and figuratively larger than life. When it's 2, it's one-on-one. He's never gone mano-a-mano, and he has not played that jujitsu. So if I am the Trump people, I'm hoping Johnson's on stage. It takes, to your point earlier, her playing the role of prosecutor. It's hard to prosecute somebody on the witness stand when somebody else is standing.
It's also the case that, look, even if you accept that Trump has some political skill, which he clearly does, he won the Republican nomination, what he doesn't have is policy depth. And one-on-one means just more minutes to fill. The more minutes to fill, the deeper the conversation goes. The deeper the conversation goes, the more trouble Trump is in, because she just knows more about everything than he does.
Well, this is what we've never seen. We're going to see granular. And the media, who I agree at the end of the day, the media does lean towards Hillary, will, whether they subconsciously or consciously, make it granular. They're not going to let him off the hook at this point.
And look, well, all right. We agreed.
That's amazing.
We agreed. I didn't think we would ever agree this entire show, and we agreed. So let's just, move on. All right. Donald Trump is ready, at last, to make his major immigration policy speech in Phoenix, Arizona, tomorrow. It's still unclear exactly what Trump's position will be on the 11 million or so undocumented people living in the United States, but his team has been all over the airwaves contrasting his other immigration plans with those of Hillary Clinton. One thing we can be sure of is that Trump will emphasize an idea that he hasn't wavered on: the wall. Why? Here's Trump's campaign manager and our guest yesterday, Kellyanne Conway, on Fox News Radio today.
A wall is something it's very easy for people to understand. It's physical, it's tactile, it's visible. And if you build a wall, then of course you're actually putting boundaries, not invisible boundaries, but actual boundaries between us and a country where drugs are flowing over the border, people are coming over the border. We don't know who's living among us. And by the way, it's for their safety as well.
Donnie, my question for you, Donald Trump is in a political pickle on immigration. His base is one place, the country is someplace else. Is there anything he can say tomorrow night that can get him out of that dilemma?
No, he's in a sour pickle. There's an irony here. When he's started
in a sour pickle.
You did the pickle thing. I did the sour pickle. There's an irony here in that he started out as the outsider, and Hillary Clinton is the typical politician.
Right.
Yet what Trump has been doing, I think, particularly on this issue, he keeps flip-flopping. Right. The average person in this country is not stupid. A Latino voter is not stupid.
Right.
He has shown his cards.
Yep.
And, for him to come out, it doesn't matter what he says. We feel in our guts. We know how he feels. We know what he believes. The average person knows it's 75 days before the election. He did not just see the light. He's the very thing he accuses Hillary of, following the polls, listening to the pundits. He's doing, and it's obvious. So I don't think it matters what he does now. It's baked in. People know the way he feels.
Kellyanne Conway was on this set yesterday. She said he's going to enforce existing law. That hasn't happened, right? That's her argument. We haven't enforced existing law. Of course, it's the case that Barack Obama has, in fact, deported more people than any president in history, undocumented immigrants. The law says that those 11 million people who are here illegally, most of them should be deported, right? We've our administrations, Democratic administrations, have taken a more humane posture towards that. But if Trump wants to enforce the law, as she says, he's got to start deporting people in larger numbers. And this is the problem for all Republicans. Everyone's in favor of border security. The wall is a chimera. It will never happen. But everyone says border security first. Then what? 11 million people. What are you going to do with them? Trump, at least crazy as the idea was, originally was like, well, a deportation force. Sure. That's the only solution. Well, of course, that's not the solution politically because
it isn't a primary.
It's not possible to do.
Primary, but what he's baked himself in a corner. I'm going to say it again. People vote for people, not issues. He has shown his color or lack of color. I don't mean color, but his lack of conviction here.
Right.
And that is the tell. The same thing with the Muslim ban. It's changed. He's had 170.
He looks like a politician.
170.
He looks like a politician.
Policy changes on 20 key issues.
He looks like a politician. That's not good.
Okay, primary voters will decide today whether Senators John McCain and Marco Rubio get to move on to the general election. We will talk about those races and what they're up against when we come right back. It's primary election day in Arizona and Florida, where three high-profile candidates are trying to keep their jobs and advance the general election. Joining us from the Sunshine State, where Marco Rubio and former DNC chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz are defending their seats, is MSNBC political correspondent Casey Hunt. And out in Grand Canyon country, where Senator John McCain is campaigning hard, is NBC News correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly, let's start with you. Where does McCain's primary contest sit now, and how tough has it been for the senator?
Well, it has certainly been tough in the optics and the politics of this heated campaign season. But polling shows McCain pretty far ahead of his challenger, who is very conservative. She's a Trump supporter, 47-year-old Kelly Ward. She has served in the state legislature, and by profession, she's an osteopathic physician. She has been hammering McCain on his age, on incumbency, on issues. But McCain is out front, according to polls. So that creates a challenge on primary day, not wanting voters to sit home because they think it's an easy race. That's true here. It's true in politics in lots of places. Arizona gets pretty hot here in August, and getting people to the polls. We stopped at a polling place. Turnout did not look particularly strong, but then you've got to factor in early voting, where voters have been able to do that pretty much the whole month of August, where they're able to send in their ballots, and that could have a real impact here. So when we spoke to McCain today, he was saying that he feels confident, in part because they've had a lot of young supporters who've been trying to get people to the polls, do the phone banking, trying to get them to turn out.
Casey, the same question to you across the country and still in the southern part of the world down there in Florida. Marco Rubio has a primary. A lot of people didn't even know if he was going to run for re-election. So how's that primary stand? Seems like he's pretty safe.
Yeah, I got to tell you guys, I didn't expect to be covering the Senate primary with Marco Rubio's name on the ballot based on what he had told us earlier this year. Quite a litany of reasons why he was not interested in returning to the Senate. Obviously, he changed his mind after the primary didn't go his way. He is facing someone who has a little bit of a Trump-like profile. He's a Sarasota businessman, but he's running far behind Rubio. Rubio's expecting to win big here tonight, and that sets him up to potentially face Patrick Murphy, the Democrat, in the general election. He has a primary as well, but he's expected to win there. Of course, Rubio is running ahead of Donald Trump here at the moment, but he's run into a couple of speed bumps when reporters have asked him about some of the things he had to say about Trump during the primary, since, of course, Rubio's now endorsed Trump, says Floridians should vote for him. The Miami Herald Ed Board asked him whether or not he stood by the statements that he'd made, whether he was he still believed Trump was a con man. Rubio says, I stand by everything. I'd be interested to see if he sticks to that line through November, if Trump's lead, or if Trump continues to slip here in Florida, Hillary Clinton having the lead in polls.
Kelly, let's take a look at the general election. If McCain wins today, as we all expect him to, he will face, likely, Congresswoman Ann Kirkpatrick in November. The latest general election polling from CNN has McCain leading 52 to 39%. So give me a sense of what you think the general election's challenges are going forward for Senator McCain.
Well, when you talk to allies of McCain, what they are concerned about is a Hillary Clinton effect. If she is doing well in Arizona, and certainly Democrats are trying to target Arizona, in part it's long been one of their target states, and they're looking at changing demographics. So with Clinton at the top of the ticket, could that help another woman candidate, another Democrat? McCain goes by his argument that he has 100% name ID, that voters will judge him on who he is and who he has been over time. So he's making it personal about the kind of service he's provided to Arizonans. At the same time, his allies will say that Trump is this unpredictable factor. If he is a drag on Republicans in Arizona, could that hurt McCain? The math is there for it to be a problem. At the same time, as you point out, he's got an advantage in polling. Money isn't an issue. But they also know that Democrats have some other high target states where they may spend most of their resources before they get to Arizona in terms of trying to flip the Senate to try to flip this state for Hillary Clinton. So it will be a tough fight. Expect McCain to really grit it out. He likes a fight. That kind of brings out the old warrior in him. And they see Ann Kirkpatrick as a formidable opponent, someone who's gotten a lot of attention and could be helped by Hillary Clinton if she does well here, and especially with Latino voters who they're certainly trying to register if they aren't already on the rolls.
Kelly,
John?
obviously we know the history of Senator McCain and Donald Trump. Now that we move to a general election, what's the Trump strategy? We know how he feels personally. How does he play it to the electorate?
My expectation is that John McCain will not spend time with Donald Trump. He can do that on several levels. He's been the nominee of his party. He made a promise to support the nominee of his party before anyone knew it would be Donald Trump. So he'll keep that promise in terms of supporting him. But it doesn't mean he has to appear with him, doesn't mean he has to campaign with him. And McCain gets irritated when he is asked about Trump day after day after day after day. He knows those questions are coming, but he'll try to separate himself on issues when necessary. But when I asked him about trying to navigate this sort of difficult thing where he doesn't want to alienate the Trump voter, doesn't want to risk his place with the party, needs those voters to turn out, and at the same time knows he's running against a more moderate Democrat, how do you do that? And he goes back to his own personal brand and trying to sell that. So will there be Trump unity with other elected officials in Arizona? I certainly don't see that now. And so there was some talk about Trump having a unity event here in Arizona. I don't see folks lining up to do that. John McCain will have his campaign trail perhaps going in a different direction when Trump is in this state.
Kelly O'Donnell from Arizona, thank you. We lost Casey Hunt, who was and still is in Florida. She's just not with us right now.
Yes.
When we come back...
We haven't actually lost her.
Well, she's there. She
Good.
just lost us, basically. When we come back, a pastor repents. Right after this.
Welcome back. We are joined now by Dan Senor. Man, we have missed him so much on this show. He's a guy who has advised Mitt Romney and all kinds of other folks, including his dear friend, Paul Ryan. Dan, I want to ask you, in this little short block, we're going to have you back after our next commercial break so we can talk long and about the campaign. But I just want to ask you about Pastor Mark Burns, who today, a Donald Trump surrogate, African-American pastor, tweeted this blackface cartoon of Hillary Clinton yesterday, defended it, then today apologized. The big question about this to me is it seems like with Donald Trump and minority outreach, every step forward is taken by at least 1, 2, sometimes 3 steps
10,
backward.
20.
Is this something that you think has any chance of going anywhere good?
No.
Minority outreach piece, I mean,
No,
broadly.
because, look, I think there are strong conservative arguments for how minorities have been ill-served by Democratic and liberal policies, right? Whether you look at the education issues, you look at the welfare reform debate, a lot of criminal justice, crime issues. But the way to wage those arguments, if you are conservative, is not to accuse your opponent of being racially prejudiced. I strongly disagree with Hillary Clinton on a range of issues. I do not think she is a bigot. So I do think there is resonance for making these cases for conservatives. This is not the way for Trump and his surrogates to do it, and I think the way they're doing it is just reinforcing a lot of the perceptions I think voters have.
And along perceptions, I want to go back to your experience with Romney. I had a thesis in the last segment that basically voters aren't stupid, and they hear enough over a period of time, and it registers. My feeling, there's nothing he can do with the minority vote at this point. Working with Romney, were there any baked-in issues that were all along baked in you were actually able to turn? Was there a certain moment in time, we're basically 9 weeks away from the election, where it's transparent, it's clear, and you ain't moving those needles on some very core issues like this?
No, I think once you're on the eve of Labor Day, the idea, I mean, perhaps, small issues maybe, big issues like you're saying, core issues, the idea that on the eve of Labor Day you can make a massive transformation, absolutely not. I mean, for this entire campaign, Donald Trump has made, among the centerpieces of his campaign, trafficking and kind of economic nationalism, ethnic tribalism, vulgar isolationism. Those are the big themes of his campaign. The idea that he can dramatically change the way certain segments of the electorate perceive those issues and the way he's talked about them now, 70, 80 days out, it's extremely difficult, particularly, by the way, if you have no organization, no media, no real media capacity, no real ground capacity. How do you no real surrogate operation? How do you actually marshal the army that you need on television and through surrogates to convey that? I just think it's very difficult.
Dan, I know you were like on the French Riviera or on the Aegean Sea on your yacht or something last week, so that's why you may have missed.
Unbelievable.
I wish the audience knew how you mocked him off camera.
Yeah, I don't come to this show to get service.
This is a guest.
Just a little
this man
bit.
took time out of his day.
Yes.
Dan knows how much I love him. Here's the thing. You missed a lot of the discussion last week around this minority outreach thing, which is none of this about minorities. He's not trying to change anything.
Yeah.
All he's really trying to do is reassure white, suburban Republican-leaning women.
Right.
Is that working? Can it work?
No. I mean, first of all, I do believe that is probably what's going on. What they're really trying to do is sort of calm down upper middle class whites in the suburbs and exurbs. Again, I just don't, you can't spend a year campaigning aggressively with such aggressive rhetoric and dominate the media discussion, the media landscape with one position and then just flip it late, whether you're trying to actually reach minority voters or you're trying to reach this sort of other segment of the electorate that you think it will resonate with them, that you're trying to reach out to minority voters.
Before we go to break, and you're not getting many statistics on this, just in terms of gut. Obviously, Donald's been putting out the health conspiracies. To women voters and to voters, does that in a certain way backfire, where it's just, you kind of see through it, it seems like below the belt, kung fu fighting, or does it start to register? And once again, I have not seen any numbers on this, so I'm just asking you as an operator.
Look, there's no data to evidence that it's breaking through, and I just think Trump, if anyone wants to make the argument that a particular candidate is not being totally transparent on records, Trump isn't the person to prosecute that case. I mean, the fact that every single day someone is making the point that he still, and it's perplexing, that he still will not release his tax returns.
It's not perplexing. He can't.
Well, okay, maybe.
He
but
pays
it's
zero in
perplexing.
taxes. Not because he's a crook, because that's what real estate people pay in taxes, zero, and he gives very little charity. He will never release this.
But what's perplexing is that a nominee of a major party heading into the general election has not released his tax returns. That's amazing. So how he actually makes that argument, it just sort of seems absurd.
That's
Man, what I wouldn't pay to get a look at Donnie Deutsch's tax returns.
Not that interesting, but that is I disagree with him on almost everything. You're passionate about him releasing his tax returns. I feel the same way. His job as a citizen, and it's travesty that he's not.
Totally. Dan Senor, stick with us. We'll continue this conversation right after this break. We are back with Dan Senora, a Republican smart guy who's advised Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, and many others. Dan, I'm going to ask you to do something that is sort of akin to me asking Donnie to be humble, which means it's not very likely that it would ever happen in the real world. But
He mocks his
There's-
sit-in co-host. He's an angry man.
Right.
pretend that you are running Donald Trump's debate prep.
Oh, I would love that.
What would you?
I would just love that.
What would you do? If you were actually, I'm taking it seriously. If you really were, like, what do you think the main challenges would be and the main strategic objectives? How would you go about it?
The first thing I would say is don't take the wrong lessons from the primary debates, because what you're about to experience in the general election debate is nothing comparable to the primary election debate. The primary election, he was on a stage with 13 people, and while those debates were an hour and a half to 2 hours in any given evening, the amount of actual time that he was on for, cumulatively, 10, 15, 20 minutes? He had a lot of breaks during those debates. Not only ad breaks, but he had breaks when Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio were fighting. He had breaks when Chris Christie and Marco Rubio were fighting.
It's not even the breaks. It's that he gets to be king of the hill and there's 17 little
Right.
dudes.
But
So it's not even just the time, it's actually the whole
dynamic,
gymnastics
but it's
of it.
also the stamina. I was struck when I was doing debate prep. I did some debate prep with Rubio, so I'd be at some of the debates, and even when you'd see Trump backstage, and I talked to others who were involved with debates who would say he was exhausted. He actually didn't like the debate process that much. He liked his moments, which are often effective, but he didn't like standing up there for hours and having to deal with all the sort of fatigue that's associated with that. Now, he's on. 100 million people will be watching. It's just him against one person. It's not him against 13 people. There are no breaks. There's no distractions. And actually, Hillary Clinton has had much more debate experience that's relevant to these kinds of debates. Her debates with Bernie Sanders in the last half of this primary process are much more similar to what she'll be dealing with Trump. Her debates with Barack Obama, basically one-on-one in 2008. She has much more experience. Do mock debates. Do lots. He said apparently he doesn't want to do mock debates. Just in terms of getting into that rhythm and knowing what it's like.
You know, funny, he doesn't want to do a lot of stuff that you got to do for that show. I want to bounce a theory off both of you guys. I have a feeling, regardless of what's on the docket, there may just be one debate. Because if somehow Donald Trump wins that debate, he's going to go, good night, drive safely. And if he gets humiliated, he's not going back up there. So I have a feeling this could be our only debate. Any thoughts on that?
It's always been my view that that everything except for the first debate is up for grabs. The dates of the debates, how many there would be, everything else, for exactly the reasons you're talking about. And you know, the Trump campaign has not been. They've not said we're committed to all three debates in these locations under the auspices of the Commission on Presidential Debates. So I think there's some chance, for the reasons you say, Donnie, that after that first debate, that things could change.
He would have to do so well for him to bail. I mean, even if he does well, I don't think he does well enough that he says, I'm done. I have this locked.
That's the problem, is that he's so far, he's probably coming from such a...
What's the best he could do in this debate? The best he could do is probably bring most of the Republican voters home, which is what happened with Romney after the first debate. So Romney, after the first debate in Denver against Obama, it tightened right up. His numbers went way up. But when you dig down, what really happened is he just brought home skeptical Republicans. I think Trump could do the same thing. That's not winning the election.
But if he does it, and then the absence of a negative going forward, let's say he wins a debate, not by 3 touchdowns, but he wins a solid debate. And I think people start to kind of think a little bit differently. I think he's more concerned of the stunning negative, that one ignorant gaffe, that one explosion where, that Howard Dean moment. I love Howard Dean, but as an example. Right. So absence of a future negative, I still think there could be on.
Right, let me ask you this question about, we talked about it before, about Gary Johnson. What do you think the implications are? If Johnson gets in the debate, it means what for each of them, Clinton and...
Yeah, I used to think that he was just a problem for Trump, that he would just has the potential to get disaffected Republican voters who are unhappy with Trump somewhere to go, and him being on the stage allows that to happen. But you watch the positions he's taken, the arguments he's made. There's a lot there that could reach out to appeal to Hillary voters, could appeal to Bernie Sanders voters. And so I actually think him being there is potentially a problem for both of them, and it's not clear to me who. I think there are voters that should be going to both of them that could wind up going to Johnson. If I were either one of them, I wouldn't want him there.
Agree. Let me ask you both a question. If you were the moderator and you each had the gotcha question for each candidate, John, let me start with you. Which would be the compelling? You got one question for each. Put them on the spot.
Man, I don't know. That's like a really good question. I'm trying to come up with one off the top of my head. I mean, I think you would want to try to test Trump on substance and on policy in a way that doesn't feel ridiculous. But that doesn't feel ridiculous, like you're asking him to name the capital of some obscure country somewhere in the world. Try to do something like, I think, I'm not sure he could name
the Prime Minister of Britain.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure he could name which. I mean, I would ask you. You can sound very condescending, but I'm not. Basic geography, some questions about the Constitution. He's been confused about the number of articles in the Constitution
right.
before. Like trying to get him to reveal some glaring flaw that anyone who's president of the United States should know the answer to, which he doesn't.
You don't even have to go that far.
What would be your specific question?
No.
Give me the question.
I mean, I actually think you don't need to do a true gotcha. If you remember that one of the last debates that both Rubio and Trump were in, where Rubio started to press Trump on policy. I think it was the debate in Texas during the primary, where on his health care plan. And Trump and Rubio said, I will give you my time. Imagine Hillary said, I'll give you my time. Explain your health care plan. You have my time. And he couldn't, and he kept referring to the lines, and then Rubio.
Right.
But, like, actually, you don't have to do gotcha.
Right.
Just actually press him on basic policy.
Right.
And
his
yield
own
your
policy.
Time. Right,
What's
and
the
yield
Clinton
your
question?
time.
What's
Say,
the
I will give
question?
you
Well, I'm going to ask Dan's the guest here. So what do you think would be the best question to go at Clinton for? Clinton with in this context?
In terms of
Gotcha, or the toughest questions he's going to have.
I think making sort of dissecting the first term Obama national security legacy. I think, again, I would stick with policy and really make her own that period. The best shot Republicans, Trump have against Hillary is to make this election, which it is, there should be a change election, and make her the third term of what many voters think has been at worst a failed, at best an unsatisfying presidency. Make her own that. And so ask questions that deal with her policy legacy when she was Secretary of State. It's not pretty. The world is a mess.
Dan, you saw Mitt Romney struggle with immigration and the Hispanic vote up close in 2012 and not being able to solve the deportation question and getting tagged as a self-deportation advocate. What can Trump do tomorrow in his immigration speech to solve the problem he has between what the general electorate wants on immigration and what his base demands?
I don't think much. I mean, if you believe that tomorrow he's trying to say something to reassure Latino voters as opposed to just, white, educated, as we talk, suburban and exurban voters. If you believe he's actually trying to reach Latino voters, I just think Hillary Clinton, the DNC, all the affiliated super PACs have a massive amount of resources to just remind the electorate that regardless of what Trump says, this is what he actually has been arguing for the past year. And this is where I think we, who follow these elections minute to minute, tend to think this speech is important, that speech is important, this TV appearance, this cable show. At this stage of the election, if you're a voter in, say, Ohio, are you paying that much attention to Donald Trump's immigration speech? Right. What's going to have a bigger impact on you, that or the 30 or 20 ads you're going to see during the week on your local broadcast channel just reminding you that Donald Trump is trafficked in xenophobic, rhetoric and a xenophobic crowd? So I don't think one speech at this stage of the general election, it's all about mass deployment of media and grassroots organization. A speech doesn't change.
Just to be clear, if it wasn't already clear to everyone in this audience, Dan Senor is famously never Trump. Dan Senor, thank you for being on the show.
Not clear. He uses a lot of really big words.
Dan Balls of the Washington Post will join us next. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
wasn't softening on anything. He didn't change his stance on anything. What he did was, and what he's done all along, is he's speaking with the people. He's not lecturing them like most of the politicians you see today. He's actually having a conversation. He basically surveyed the room and asked, hey, what are your thoughts on this? I want to take that because I want to take into account what the people say. Unlike our opponent, who basically will take into account only those who contribute millions and millions of dollars to her campaign, he's actually having a conversation with the people of this country.
That was Donald Trump Jr.'s son, or one of them, Don Jr., talking about his father's immigration plan on CNN. That interview airs tonight. Right now, the ball's in our court. And so we're joined by Dan Balz, chief correspondent of The Washington Post. Also with us, former National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders' campaign, Simone Sanders. They are both in Washington, D.C. Dan, I'm going to put age before beauty and start with you. Tomorrow, Trump, immigration. We just asked Dan Senor this question. Can Trump get out of the political pickle he currently finds himself in?
Not easily, John. He's got to try to do two things. He's got to try to reassure the people who have cheered him for his very, very hardline anti-immigration stance from the beginning of the campaign. He's got to reassure them that he hasn't really moved. And at the same time, he's got to try to convince people who think he's been too harsh that he is a little bit more open to some softening, if you will. He won't use that word, but that's what he'll try to convey. And that's not an easy path to walk. It's a very difficult thing he's got to do. So I think he's got his work cut out for him, frankly.
So Dan, walk that tightrope for me. What does he do? Give me, obviously, those objectives. I couldn't disagree more. What do you do with that?
Well, I think, first of all, he will concentrate on enforcing the law in as tough a way as he can, while he will be probably somewhat vague on what you do about the 11 million. I mean, I'm reminded of some of the things he's said over the past few days sound very much like what Rick Perry used to say months and months and months and months ago, which is you deal with the border, you solve the border problem, and you don't worry about anything else until you've done that. And that doesn't mean you're not continuing to deport criminals or violent criminals who are here illegally, but that in one way or another, you don't make a first priority. The deportation piece of what Donald Trump said from the beginning was a key part of his policy.
Simone, let me ask you this question. We were talking in the block before this about Pastor Mark Burns and his tweet that showed Hillary Clinton in blackface. Donald Trump is ostensibly trying to do some minority outreach to African Americans. When you have surrogates like that, should he, at this point, just sort of give up on this? Or is it still appreciated, you think, among African Americans that he's at least going to try, go to Detroit, give a speech to an actual African American audience and try to talk to that community?
Well, you know, one, I think it's okay if you want to disavow some of your surrogates, and perhaps the Trump campaign should explore that. I think his outreach by Republicans and the Republican Party is still appreciated, but if we're talking about African Americans specifically, I'm hard-pressed to find how Donald Trump can actually make inroads. Now, I do want to give credit where credit is due. I have been saying for weeks now that if Donald Trump really wants to reach out to African-American voters, he needs to talk to some African-American people in some African-American spaces, and he should probably go to an African-American church. I'm happy to hear that he's going on this weekend, but I'm wondering what we're going to hear Donald Trump say. We haven't really heard any real policy prescriptions from Donald Trump when it comes to African-American and minority communities. I mean, again, I am interested in hearing what he's going to say tomorrow in terms of immigration. He really is walking this tightrope, but do African-American voters believe him, this pivot, if you will? I don't think so, because Donald Trump is still running the same race he was running a year ago. I just think Donald Trump has on different shoes. So this week it's an African-American church. Next week, you know, he could be hitting up a barber shop, but he still has those same, he's still using that same divisive rhetoric, and we haven't seen any real policy prescription.
Simone, there was an NBC poll that came out with, I thought, some surprising numbers encouraging for Trump as far as independent voters. His margin, Hillary's lead has gone from 8 to 4%. So he's making some inroads with the independent voters, which means he's probably starting to sway some of the Sanders people, which is stunning and surprising to me, given the previous numbers had it about 90%. Just in terms of your ear to the ground, are you hearing any Sanders people giving Trump a second look?
You know what? I'm hearing a couple people giving Trump a second look in terms of what he has done recently. So again, this pivot that if you will, that Donald Trump has made is not a real pivot to get African American or Latino voters. This is a real pivot to keep those folks that, you know, were leaning Republican or that were kind of like Trump supporters, but were really maybe really moderate Democrats that have now said, oh, I can't possibly vote for someone who is spewing such divisive, such in times racist and bigoted rhetoric. We can't vote for them. So I think that that's what you're seeing in these numbers. But when we get to the debate, I think that's where the rubber really meets the road. You know, that's when a lot of people are going to be really tuned in. We've been tuned in for such a long time, but lots of the American people haven't. And what Donald Trump says on that debate stage, is he going to go out there and be himself, or is he going to be the new polished up Kellyanne version? We don't know.
Right.
But I think that will make a difference in what these numbers look like.
Dan, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask a similar version of the same question to you, Simone. But Dan, start with you. New York Times editorial board today comes out with a very tough editorial about the Clinton Foundation, saying that they got to cut ties in a significant way, not shut the foundation down, but stop taking corporate and foreign donations right now. Tell me what you think of that, and where do you think this story goes from here, when even a liberal voice as strong as the New York Times editorial board is where it is on this issue?
I don't think it will sway the thinking of the people at the Clinton Foundation about what they do about foreign donations now. I mean, I think their feeling is that you can't cut something like that off immediately, that there has to be some kind of a transition period. Whether it's politically smart or not is a different question, but I don't think practically they think that that's possible or even advisable given the work that's being done with some of that money. But I think that editorial was another flashing light for the Clinton operation, that they have to think even more seriously about what they do if she becomes president. I think it's clear that there is as kind of a building support or building consensus that they have to probably go farther than they have announced that they're willing to go. We'll see, but I think that this is going to be a continuing issue, and it will become a big issue if she gets elected.
So, Simone, as I said, similar question. Raul Grijalva today, congressman from Arizona, big supporter of Bernie Sanders, came out and he said that Hillary Clinton's got to break ties with the foundation to make this issue go away politically. Do you sense in the Democratic Party that there's some drift in that direction?
I think what there is nobody likes a distraction, right? We want to be focused on the election. We want to be talking about the issues. And at this point, the conversation, not the foundation as itself, but the conversation around the foundation has become a distraction to the election and a distraction to the issues. So, yeah, the conversation currently around the party is we would like to get back to talking about the issues. There are lots more things at play than, what Judicial Watch has dug up and this controversy they've helped create around the Clinton Foundation. That being said, I do think that the Clinton campaign realized that this has become a distraction, and the Clinton Foundation in itself as well. And that's why you saw the foundation coming out saying, with its new set of guidelines, if the secretary is to become president, that they're going to change the name. And I don't think that in terms of the New York Times editorial board, they have to cut ties right now. We have to remember the Clinton Foundation does really, really great work that no one else was doing, not only in this country, but around the globe. And so we need that work to continue. That work is important. That work is viable. The people that donate to the Clinton Foundation, good stuff. So I think it has become a distraction, and currently that distraction, we're trying to tamp that down.
Simone, one name. Who should play Donald Trump in debate prep with Hillary Clinton?
You know what? I don't know. Donald Trump is a special character, but Mark Cuban said he wanted the job, so I say give it to him.
Dan, you ready to second that? Mark Cuban for that job?
I think you have to go with Bob Barnett. He's the veteran debate prepper, so we just stick with him.
I'm throwing my hat in the ring.
All right, we're going to say Donnie Deutsch is who I think. All right, Dan Ball, Simone Sanders, thank you for coming on the show. Coming right up, what happens when Donnie impersonates the Donald? We'll find out in a mock debate, and I do mean it's a mock debate, all right, when we come right back.
reports emerge on how the candidates are preparing for debates, we noticed that Hillary Clinton is considering an interesting cast to play Donald Trump. People like Mark Cuban, James Carville, even Alec Baldwin and Jon Stewart. I would actually like to make a plea. Hillary, pick me. I would be great. I'm from Queens. I've known Trump for years. I shoot from the hip just like him, and I'm a natural self-promoter.
Also that hair.
Yes, yes. Come on, dude. I can understand why you might be reluctant to take me seriously, so I asked my friend John Heilman to stage a mock, and as John said in the tease, a truly mock debate with me. He will play the part of Hillary, you, and I, of course, will be Mr. Trump, and our colleague Joe Wiesenthal offered to be the moderator.
Please welcome the candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Wow. Like, your hands really are a lot smaller than average.
All right, let's begin. The biggest threat to the next president is likely to be ISIS. Donald Trump, how do you plan to deal with ISIS?
Well, while Mrs. Clinton was futzing around with her emails and cozying up with the Clinton Foundation and lying down because she's got no stamina, I was making my ISIS plan. And we're going to bomb every ISIS-ICER there is.
Secretary Clinton, your response.
Mr. Trump, first of all, let's just discuss the question of whether you even know what ISIS is. What do those letters stand for?
Well,
ISIS.
Our president doesn't seem to know because he always throws in the ISIL. This guy doesn't even know. At least I know it's ISIS.
Mr. Trump, I mean, you accuse me constantly of having profiteered from my speeches and my family foundation. I think the people of America know that the Clinton Foundation does good work. We've saved millions of lives. We've worked on AIDS. We've worked on malaria. We've worked on all those things. Now, if I happen to get a little bit rich in the process, at least I'm actually rich, buddy. Can I speak about some foreign policy, please? The various countries that border France, which do you think is the greatest threat to American security? First, can you name the countries that border France, Buster?
This is not a quiz, okay? I'm not here to answer quizzes.
It's France,
and listen to me.
It's France.
We bailed their asses out in World War II, and we'll do it again if we have to, okay?
Donald Trump, it's not your turn right now, but I'd like to ask you another question. Hillary Clinton has alleged that you lack the temperament to be president. How do you respond to that accusation?
We've heard a lot about my temperament, and the key word is temper. And when I think about the Clinton Foundation, my temper rises. It certainly does. And when I think about those emails, my temper goes through the roof.
Secretary Clinton, would you like to respond?
What actually are your issues with Article 12 of the Constitution, Mr. Trump? What are your issues? What are your problems with Article 12?
It's a beautiful article. It's a beautiful article. And everybody knows how much I love the Constitution. Speaking of Constitution, do you think you have the Constitution to stand up for 90 minutes because we heard something about your health issues?
Ha! There is no Article 12 of the Constitution, you moron.
Okay, candidates, please.
We
each
agreed
take
there were no
turns.
props. He's not going to take out that damn Constitution again. We said no props.
Okay, this is enough.
See, this is what
enough.
she does.
Let's break for dinner.
Mr. Trump, I have your McDonald's.
Thank you, Chris. You got the McNuggets?
McNuggets, extra sauce.
None for you. On behalf of John and myself, we apologize. We'll be right back.
So, Donnie, thanks, Mark, for letting him do the show. Head to BloombergPolitics.com for all your 2016 news coming up. Bloomberg West. Until tomorrow, from Donnie, the grateful Donnie, and me, we both say sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. FBI Director James Comey told a cybersecurity conference in Washington today that the Bureau is trying to determine if hackers connected to a foreign government want to influence U.S. elections this fall.
Those kinds of things are something we take very, very seriously and work very, very hard to understand so that we can equip the rest of our government with options for how to deal with it.
Director Comey's remarks came as Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid asked the FBI to investigate the threat of Russian tampering with the U.S. elections. The spokesman for Islamic State is dead. Abu Muhammad al-Adnani was reportedly killed while surveying the group's defenses in Aleppo, Syria. German lawmaker Jürgen Hart says if the UK wants the advantages of the European Union's single market following Brexit, it will have to help pay into the EU's budget. Hart, an ally of Chancellor Angela Merkel, says Norway is a non-EU member but contributes to the bloc's finances in return for market access. A Monmouth University